Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you for your patience. We are just having a few little technical challenges. But yeah, we wanted to go ahead and kick off the event while our other two panelists are working to sign in. Hi everyone, my name is Caroline Sorge. I serve as the Vice Chair of the UNA-NCA, which stands for United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. Long time, Sustainable Development Committee. And it is a great privilege to host this event about climate justice. So what we're going to talk about today is the relationship between climate justice in the DMV to the UN Global Goals at Home program. The UN Global Goals at Home program is an essential framework for understanding and acting towards equitable climate justice planning and policy in the United States. So often we're thinking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals in an international context or application. However, this program is challenging us to look inward at our own communities. How are we serving the people around us, our neighbors, and meeting basic needs that are encompassed by the SDGs? So this committee has partnered with organizations like the DC Department of Energy and the Environment, Resilient Earth Capital, and the Anacostia Waterway Society to speak about some of the areas of equitable climate justice and some of these sustainable development goals, which are being addressed through local and state priorities, as well as those areas of equitable climate justice that are needing growth as well here. Hi, John Paul, great to see you.
Hi,
Thank you for
Sarah.
joining. We're just kicking off the event with an initial introduction. So this event, it will increase public understanding and advocacy for climate justice here locally, while also tying into, how are we meeting the UN SDGs here at home. So some of the main SDGs that we'll be addressing throughout the presentation are Goal 6, which is clean water and sanitation, Goal 10, which is reduced inequalities, Goal 11, which is sustainable cities and communities, Goal 13, which is climate action, Goal 14, which is life below water, Goal 15, life on land, and finally Goal 17, partnerships for the goals. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. So with us today, we have Aaron Garnas-Holmes, and he leads climate adaptation planning for the District of Columbia with the DOEE Urban Sustainability Administration. He coordinates the implementation of projects like Climate Ready DC, the district's plan to prepare for the impacts of a changing climate, as well as Keep Cool DC, which is the district's extreme heat adaptation strategy. And Aaron is currently focused on the establishment of a network of resilience hubs in the district as well. He's trained as a landscape architect and an urban planner with over 10 years of experience working at that intersection of resilient design and environmental justice. He has collaborated with organizations like the Anacostia Watershed, Urban Waters Federal Partnership, as well as the Anacostia Waterfront Trust. So that is a little bit about Aaron. I also want to share a bit about John Paul Mascarella. So John Paul is an international clean energy and climate finance executive with over 35 years of experience. He is the founder of Resilient Earth Capital and the founder and managing director of Cool Pact Capital Advisors. And in his role at Resilient Earth Capital, he works with a collective of angel investors dedicated to fostering climate action through strategic funding and support. His team leverages climate finance, adaptation, and resilience experience with renewable energy and principal investing expertise to drive sustainable growth. And then at Cool Pact Capital, his focus is on high impact climate tech investments in emerging contexts such as India, particularly looking at innovative cooling solutions for extreme heat conditions. He also serves as an advisory board member at the Chesapeake Bay Seed Capital Fund and is involved in a variety of other clean tech and clean energy ventures, both locally and internationally. And I see Chris is on the line. Thank you so much, Chris, for finding your way in. I know it was difficult with the Zoom link not being so straightforward, so thank you. Chris Williams is president and CEO of the Anacostia Watershed Society. And prior to joining that society in 2021, he also served as a senior vice president for conservation at American Rivers. And before that, as a director of freshwater programs at the World Wildlife Fund, leading river and watershed conservation programs across the US and around the world. He is a pioneer in corporate and NGO partnerships, an innovator in natural resources conservation and management, and a leading professional for federal environmental law and policy. So with his team at the Anacostia Watershed Society, he is working to lead a skilled team to really help provide a big role in the natural, social, and economic history and future of Washington, D.C. So I want to welcome all of our panelists, and let's kick off the conversation. So first, I just want to ask each of you, what motivated you to kind of grow in this direction with your career? So I'll start with Erin. Can you share with us what motivated you to become a climate program analyst at the DOEE?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Happy to talk about all these issues with John Paul and with Chris. I don't think many people like aspire to be a program analyst. I'm not sure it's the title that drew me to the work, but I throughout my career I've felt, and I think that a lot of people know this and feel this, that there's like two great crises of our time. There's like the climate emergency, and then there's sort of the growing social inequality in the world, and what are we going to do about that? And they're all the ways that they interact. When I started my career in DC and during the recession in 2009, I worked at Bread for the City in an AmeriCorps position, which was maybe focusing on one of those crises. But while I was there, I had this really lucky opportunity to work on this expansion to our building where they were considering doing a green roof, and I got to help transform it from just a regular extensive green roof into a more intensive one where we got to grow food for the food pantry. I was young and inspired by this like green technology having a role in like addressing social inequity. So off I went to grad school for landscape architecture, which I thought was the field to do that, um, and urban planning. And after I graduated, I worked in a couple different environments for private sector and some nonprofit arenas. But I always had my eye on DOEE here in DC when I came back to DC in 2017, because it's for those of you in the district, I think I can brag about this, but it's like a very high functioning agency. We do a lot of really good work with really driven, smart people. And I think that cities are the arena where a lot of climate work is happening, both on mitigation and now on resilience and adaptation. And so it was a huge privilege to be, sort of invited into the fold of DOEE to be able to work on Climate Ready DC and the things that I'm sure I'll talk about later on. But as a landscape architect, I think that, we like to build green things, and those green things are actually a really amazing technology for addressing climate. So it's a way to take the technical skills that I learned and work on something more community-based here at DOE.
Well, and Chris, what about you? Can you tell us more about your role at the Anacostia Watershed Society and what mission motivates you and your team to do this wonderful work?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Caroline, for having me today. I apologize for being late, but I had to fight my way through the technical glitches, but I got here. As far as my organization is concerned, AWS was founded in 1989 with a mission to protect and restore the Anacostia River for all who live here and for future generations. And at that time, when we were founded, the Anacostia River was considered one of the 10 most polluted waterways in the United States. So we felt like we had a lot of work to do. And the first step was to bring folks down to the river to do cleanups and do kayak and canoe trips and make folks aware that the Anacostia River was this, at one time, was this incredible natural resource running through the heart of DC. And with work, it could be again. So that was really the start of our mission. And we've grown from essentially one person with a vision to a staff of about 18 folks, working with very closely with DOE and a lot of other partners to, again, protect and restore the Anacostia watershed. And of course, particularly in the last 10 years or so, it's really become evident that our work is very much impacted by and needs to take into account and try to mitigate for climate change. The climate is changing. In fact, we don't really need to talk about it in the future tense anymore. The climate has changed, and it is impacting natural resources. It's changing the rules by which rivers and watersheds have operated for thousands of years. And in DC, it's going to manifest and it is starting to manifest already in higher high tide lines along the river, in more frequent and more intense rain events, but also coupled by potential periods of drought. And the Mid-Atlantic is not an area that's really used to dealing with drought. So again, a lot of different considerations need to be taken into account when working to protect and restore a natural resource like the Anacostia River. I've actually been grappling with thinking about climate change since when I started my career in conservation in the early 90s. That's when NGOs and governments were really starting to grapple with climate change and how it was going to impact the way we do what we do. And back then, the answer to the question, which is still just as true, is one of the best bulwarks against climate change is healthy natural systems. So working to make the Anacostia River as healthy an ecosystem as possible is an important part of the equation. But even that answer won't really protect people from the impacts of climate change. So you have to think beyond a healthy natural system to how do you manage that system in a way that secures water quality, that secures communities from flooding. And so that's become part of our work as well.
Wonderful. Seems very holistic, and I'm looking forward to hearing more as we go. So John Paul, can you tell us more about your work at Resilient Earth Capital and what it is that motivates you to do this initiative?
Thanks, Caroline. I'm very happy to be here. I live in Baltimore now. I am sort of from everywhere. I'm very much a UN person. My father worked for the UN for nearly 40 years, 46 to 84. Summer of 46, he was the first ever intern class at the UN and never looked back. Those days are over. People don't work for one organization anymore, but that gave me the opportunity to, I grew up in Mexico, I lived in Italy, my father worked in Africa, and so our life was always sort of locally and globally. So I'm very happy to be here. What is Resilient Earth Capital? So I've been doing this work for a very long time. I went as an intern in 1992 to the Rio Earth Summit, and I never looked back. This has been my life work, and it's just sort of something that it's the challenge of our times. It is really something that we all have to sort of join hands and do collectively. One of my favorite lines is the climate doesn't stop and neither do we. So we have to do collective action. Resilient Earth Capital is a result of we built up a little company and we sold it off in 2022. I'm sort of a serial entrepreneur founder, 5 or 6 companies. I've invested in maybe 3 or 4 dozen. I've lost count. And Resilient Earth Capital really was sort of, okay, we made a little money. Let's put this to good use. So my former business partners and I just decided to start a club, an investment club that looks at anything that's climate positive. And it's a very sort of simple notion if you sort of grasp it holistically. Anything that helps reduce emissions, the arrow is pointing down, uh, more efficient, greener technology. We're in this energy transition. We are supportive of that. And it gets very nuanced, industrial applications, ag applications, and all of that. The other side of the chapter is what I call chapter two of the Paris Agreement. Climate change is already here, as Chris said, and it's hitting us on the head, and I think the aha moment for many Americans was 2017 hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria just devastated Houston. And anything that increases our resilience to climate physical risks, and we can get into what that means, the arrow is pointing up. And so the example I normally give that's very easy for everybody to understand is if you want to become more resilient, storm surges are, flooding and excess water are a big problem. So you need to build that bridge 10 or 20 feet higher. That is resiliency. And so we look at that very systematically in an investment sort of process. And if you're looking at these climate physical risks and you're understanding what you're impacted by, then, you could invest. And it's sort of more defensive investing, and it's more complicated because all we know is that the frequency of events that are causing a lot of damage is going to go up. The cost of these events is going to go up, but you still, it's just like health. Prevention is better than, trying to deal with the illness afterwards. So we spend a lot of time sort of with software, better analytics, AI to address the most recent sort of fire risk has created a lot of opportunity in that space, obviously in California. But here locally, we've invested in a community solar company called Neighborhood Sun, and I can talk a little bit more about that. But I'm happy to go into details, or if that's sort of an interest of this club, to talk about, sort of the nitty-gritty of deals.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you three gentlemen each bring a very unique and complementary perspective to climate justice. And, not only does it require action with our waterways, but it also requires us to look at extreme heat and planning and policy for that. And then, this piece around finances, kind of tying all of that together is what we're hoping to do today, bridging some of these ideas together to try to make actionable steps forward amidst some of the challenges going on right now. And so, Aaron, we worked together recently to draw ideas from community members together with existing and future climate data to inform the Climate Ready DC plan. Some of the main climate risks for DC are flooding and extreme heat. And as you're progressing this plan, what are the main priorities and next steps towards a Climate Ready DC? And how is the DOEE integrating community input from diverse stakeholders into that plan?
Sure. Well, it was great to work with you, Caroline, on this. And Smith Group last year, we worked with them on a series of community workshops and online interactive web pages to communicate some of what we're working on with Climate Ready DC. So maybe I'll answer your second question first about community input. So we hosted a series of workshops last fall. These were public workshops that were highlighting some of these, trends that we're seeing, but trying to couch it in the daily lives of district residents, not just like, here's a scary graph for the deep future, but like, how is this affecting your life today, and what are your priorities and needs in that space? We hosted these workshops in partnership with local organizations in different neighborhoods that we know have sort of increased climate vulnerability. So we did one in Ivy City. It's one of the worst heat islands in the city with Empower DC. And we did one in the sort of Deanwood neighborhood with the Ward 7 Resilience Hub Community Coalition and different neighborhoods to kind of bring in an org that has maybe more constituents locally that would draw them to events. And at those events, and we did more than just the events, we did interviews, we did focus groups, we had a survey out, we had kind of a lot going on last year. But we shared the same sort of draft actions that we're writing for an update to Climate Ready DC right now. that we've shared internally with other agencies. We send them to DDOT or DPR and say, hey, does this sound right? This is what we're thinking we're going to commit to as district government. We shared that really transparently also with the public to get like more detailed feedback on some of the ideas that we want to move forward. And we tried to really focus our efforts talking to those communities that are in either flood-prone areas or really exposed heat areas. But for the plan itself, our next steps are to update it. Climate Ready DC came out in 2016, so it's almost 10 years old. We have new climate data. We have new agencies exist and certain ones don't since back then. We have a new government that we need to recalibrate it for. And we want to make sure that the updated version of this plan does well, it has a lot of goals, but two of the major sort of themes are to recalibrate it a bit to be more focused on the lived lives of district residents and local businesses and people who are experiencing climate in the district and what those impacts might be. The first one was kind of focused more on infrastructure and governance and less on direct services to these constituents. So we're trying to put in more direct support, information, resources that people can access. And then the other one, in terms of that internal focus on DC government, John Paul mentioned like how building the bridge a little higher is resilience. We're trying to train ourselves and all of the agencies that make long-term or short-term decisions to couch those in the future projections so that we are, if you're making a decision on a project, you're building a capital asset and it's going to last for decades, are you looking at what the projections are for what the climate is in that extended lifetime of if it's a bridge, a roadway, a building, a public park, things like that. So making sure that there's going to be a ability to withstand additional precipitation, that we're building in more shade than we think we need to because it's going to become a huge asset in the future when the district is baking all summer long. So that's sort of like a quick sample of what we're looking at with Climate Ready DC. If anyone's interested, I encourage you to just Google it and you'll end up on DOE's website that has a link to those interactive pages that we built with Caroline's team where you can get a lot more of what we're chewing on with that plan update.
Yeah, I just love how it's tying together the community voices from people who are, struggling with climate change in the district, those who maybe they have a disability or they're experiencing homelessness right now. How is climate change, how is urban heat and flooding impacting their situation? So thank you so much, Erin, for sharing more about that. And Chris, kind of building on that, in DC, there's a distinct disproportion in flood risk for traditionally disadvantaged communities. Can you tell us more about how the Anacostia Watershed Society is partnering with these disadvantaged communities and other entities to innovate towards greater climate justice and prioritizing meeting those needs?
Yeah, absolutely. The issue of urban flooding is really, I think you sort of, when you're thinking about it, you need to put it in the proper context because nationally, oftentimes when people think about flooding, they think about watching the nightly news and seeing these images of, whole farm fields and towns underwater and that sort of thing. And that's terrible. Don't get me wrong. But it's not how most people experience flooding. Most people experience flooding as 2 foot of water in their basement, which may not make the national news as a major disaster, but it is a disaster for that individual family. And while the catastrophic flooding is certainly a concern, just as much of a concern, in my view, from an environmental justice perspective, is preventing that sort of neighborhood flooding that, again, doesn't tend to make the nightly news, but can be devastating to families and to neighborhoods. And so when we're looking at how we can partner with these neighborhoods, and again, looking at it from the perspective of a river conservation and management organization like ours, the emphasis is on protecting neighborhoods from flooding and doing what we can as we move forward to make neighborhoods resilient in the face of flooding. Because flooding, all of the projections tell us that flooding is going to happen. So how do we grapple with it? How do we prevent damage? How do we make neighborhoods more resilient? And one of the chief focuses of our organization in that effort is to ensure that as as development or redevelopment happens along the river, that it is done in a way that, as was mentioned before by Aaron, is looking down the road and making those decisions about how these areas are going to be restored or developed or redeveloped with an eye toward climate resilience, both on the individual site and collectively along the river. As Aaron well knows, and John Paul probably does too, there are land use and restoration decisions being made all along the Anacostia River, from Bladensburg Waterfront Park across the line in Maryland to Kenilworth Park, to Kingman Island, to Anacostia Park, to Poplar Point, to Joint Base Anacostia Polling. All of these places are in various stages of thinking, planning, discussing, doing stakeholder engagement efforts, in some places all the way to the design phase of what these spaces are going to look like and how the water around them is going to be managed over the next, 50 to 100 years. And these decisions are going to take place in the next, 5 years. The RFK site, the RFK Stadium site is another example. And all of these places have the potential, through wetlands restoration and through living shorelines and things like that, to become more adapted to flooding. Before mankind ever built anything, there almost wasn't any such thing as a flood, because all flooding is water in a system figuring out where to go when the water levels get higher. And from a human perspective, if there's no buildings there, if there's no infrastructure there, then high water isn't all that impactful. But of course, we don't live in that world anymore. Especially in a place like DC, we live in an urban environment. But you can still draw on these natural solutions like wetlands and like upland areas that are kept clear and for the purposes of taking on floodwaters. You can also design areas that are useful to people to be more sort of flood transparent. You can design play areas, you can design public spaces where the water can come in, everybody gets out of the way. After a few days, the water goes out, and then with a minimum of activity or repair, they're usable again. So all of these types of things need to be considered when we're thinking about these land use and development issues that are going to be taking place along the river over the next 5 to 10 years, which again could sort of set the pattern for how those are going to be managed in the face of a changing climate for the next 50 to 100. And AWS is involving itself to the extent that we can in all of these conversations, and also urging organizations like DOE and others that are involved in these conversations to look at them holistically, to ensure that there's a minimum level or maybe a maximum level of climate resilience being built into all of these land use decisions. Because if we do this right in each of these places and collectively, we will be successful. We could potentially be successful, probably would be successful in protecting a lot of communities in the DC area from the ravages of flooding. And there are water quality issues too, because you don't want floodwaters getting into water supply systems. So there's a water security issue, both from a water quality standpoint and from a flood security standpoint, that these natural resource decisions along the banks of the river are going to impact for a very long time. So we need to make sure we do it right.
Thank you so much. I love how you were sharing so many different strategies that we could, partner to implement in our communities. For instance, if there's a plot of land there by the shore that, we could help beautify and clean up and perhaps put some, wetlands there in place of the field of grass that's there now that was placed there by a human. Those are the kinds of action items that we could partner with you all on to improve resilience along the watershed. So thanks for all of those great ideas. John Paul, I'm wondering, I see that you're an advisory board member for the Chesapeake Bay Seed Capital
Yeah.
Fund.
I'm
And
wondering how you learned that. By the way,
yeah,
everybody just calls me JP. John Paul
okay,
is what my parents call me when I had done something wrong. John Paul.
yeah. And I know Chesapeake Bay is such an important waterway for us
Yeah.
here in the district too. So I'm wondering, like, through this group, what are some examples of climate technologies that have
Yeah.
emerged?
I'd be happy to. And this is fascinating. Just a little bit of background. I did a lot of work with the DC Green Bank in 2022. They work closely. They got their funding from DOE as well. And they were looking at how to do more lending for, developers in the district and, close by to install more solar, for example. And so solar is something that everybody understands. And with the Chesapeake Bay Seed Capital Fund, that is a venture capital fund funded by the state of Maryland through the Department of Natural Resources. The funding comes from DNR. And the goal is really to help the bay and reduce, pollution from nutrients, pollution, going into, and we were able to position, and I'll, just come out and say a company called Neighborhood Sun that I'm pretty active with, and in full disclosure, a small investor into an advisor. And the way community solar works is if you can't, build rooftop solar on your own roof, you live in an apartment, you're a renter or your home, 80% of the homes, the rules in Maryland and in many other states, about 20 something states, allow you to become a subscriber to a solar farm out in a field. And if you do that, essentially your subscription, you as a residential customer, allows you to enjoy a benefit, reduce your electricity cost by about 10%. The rules in all of these, what you may call it, community solar programs specifically target low and moderate income. And so what that means is that they want the benefits of solar to go to low and moderate income. So you'll have different classes. And for low and moderate income customers, you get a bigger discount. And sometimes it's even a full discount on your system. And I'll give an example. I live in Baltimore. There's a middle school called Henderson Hopkins. It's affiliated with Hopkins University, but it's one of those magnet schools. And they built a solar rooftop system where they have about 200, 165 neighbors that are also, so the electricity produced by the solar farm is more than the school can use. So they're able to sell all of that excess electricity to their neighbors and give their neighbors a discount. And there's something called the Climate Access Fund, which is a nonprofit, but also known as a green bank that operates here in Maryland. And they put together the financing. And then what they did is they were able to get some grants to come into that project to capitalize it first. And then they did what's called a web-based portal of crowdfunding. It used to be called Raise Green. Now it's Honeycomb Credit. And then it offered debt to the retail investing public. And some of us put money into that. And so we were able to get the grant, Climate Access Fund, funded the project, leveraged it with debt from retail investors. You're basically a bond. And then you're able to sell the electricity to your neighbors under the community solar program. And so that helps the local community with lower electricity prices. It helps the school with basically free electricity. And, it reduces the reliance on fossil fuels. Maryland is quite a green state, but we have a long way to go to meet our net zero goals by 2032, I think they are. So that's where we are. The other example I'll give is actually not a great story. I was helping a developer of very small houses here in Baltimore, and she was trying to sort of develop these container homes, these mini homes, because she came from a very disadvantaged neighborhood where they experienced flooding all the time, Chris. And she was like, this is not good. So she was trying to create a business model that the small homes were affordable for the low income communities and give them more affordable loans. And she wasn't able to put the funding together because you have to get very creative to try to match grants with some low interest loans and then have a solid customer base. And essentially, her play was resiliency, right? We are going to do these very small container homes. You will own it, but then you don't have to deal with flooding anymore. And she was unable to raise the money, and I was her advisor last year, and it was quite frustrating. So there's a lot of challenges, especially when you have overlapping financial return considerations and impact. And so I'll give you two sort of success stories. Neighborhood Sun did a great job for the Henderson Hopkins School. They signed up all those customers. If you haven't joined Neighborhood Sun, that's a great idea. And the bad side is this small tiny home developer, she was unable to get off the ground because she couldn't land the funding. So you see how we still have a lot of challenges.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing both sides of the story of that. And I think that is something that I personally have an ambition for, is to do work like that and projects like that, but then trying to find the right pathway to really get that done is sometimes difficult. Like for instance, I at one point was trying to design and build and scale these solar powered mobile clinics for an area of Cape Town that I was working in, and it was just like so difficult to actually get that done and to scale it without the funding there. So anyway, I definitely empathize and I appreciate both sides of the story. And I hope that as we kind of look towards, the future and needing more and more work in this space, that we can continue collaborating amongst each other and, tying into networks like of angel investors to help with some of these projects. And we ourselves can invest in programs like Neighborhood Sun to be a part of that and to, put our finances where our values are, and proceed that way. So thank you. I know we are running just a little bit longer than I was initially thinking, but it's no problem at all. So I'm wondering, Erin, maybe we'll just finish with these 3 questions here. So Erin, I'm wondering if you can tell us more about the River Smart and Flood Smart programs, and how are those influencing future development along the waterways in DC? How is that also coming into play with some of what Chris was saying about development along the Anacostia?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that there's more going on in those 2 programs related to development on the waterfront. But the River Smart Homes program is a program that DOE runs where we can assist a homeowner with improving the land around their house to reduce the amount of storm water that runs off their property. So you can get for your discounted rain garden, a rain barrel. There are sort of design advice that you can get on how to, sort of best design your yard to be, as it's called, river smart. That sort of focuses on stormwater runoff and the, water quality. Flood Smart Homes is obviously named after that. It's a more recent program that's more focused on water quantity challenges of having homes that flood. And similarly, DOE will send out an auditor to someone's home to inspect their risk for flooding. And so we're trying to target homes that are in like the 100-year floodplain or nearby or have experienced flooding in the past. Those auditors will evaluate the risk based on, the grading of your property, where the water's flowing from, how close to the waterway or the floodplain are you, where are the low spots on your property, and then give you a list of things that you could do to sort of shore up the resilience of your home. So that might be like installing a sump pump or maybe regrading something for water that's coming in on your property, flood proof sort of barrier doors for your basement door, things like that. And there are other more expensive improvements that might be on the list, but we don't necessarily recommend them to people, like raising the elevation of your home and things like that. But for a lot of those fixes, DOE historically would pay for the improvement as well. So it's geared towards lower income families who face flooding risk, but we'll see what that it is federally funded. So we'll see what that looks like in the future. But there are other things that DOEE does for, you're talking about development along the river. We have floodplain regulations, which all of these new developments at Poplar Point and anything at RFK in the future. There's a part of the Navy Yard that's sort of getting split off, and we'll have some neighborhood development. And all of those are subject to both our floodplain regulations, which we're updating now, expanding the restrictions from a 100-year floodplain to the 500-year floodplain. Things like needing to flood-proof your first floor and certain uses that you can't put residential use in a basement, things like that. But we also weigh in on other, zoning conversations. We do development review for all these buildings. And what I've found is that almost all the architects and developers who are working, like say down by Poplar Point, they've long thought about this already. They don't need us to tell them that they're building in a flood-prone area with risk. They are kind of already going above and beyond, because I think that in a lot of ways, parts of the private sector and people who are investing in these things, they're putting their money into it, so they know the risks already, and they're taking it a lot more seriously sometimes than I think government is in terms of where we're spending money. It's the JPs of the world, both JP here on the phone, but also like JP Morgan Chase, recently is said that they at this point are predicting like 3 degrees of warming in the future. And then I think it was Morgan Stanley said this, that it's a great investment opportunity in the air conditioning industry. But like they're watching the trends, they take it seriously, and they're both shoring up their risk and also pulling risk out of areas. You see the insurance companies, pulling out of California and Florida. So it's really interesting. There is a government role, obviously, to like make requirements for what should happen in the floodplain and to provide these resources for residents. But it'll be interesting to see, especially as the federal landscape changes, how much of climate resilience is now falling on the hands of investors to make wise choices.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful in some ways about that we do have, as individuals, some power or some autonomy to invest in these solutions and to get involved locally. So thank you, Erin, for sharing some more insights there.
It's very difficult to find and finance these resilience opportunities. And Erin can speak to that, because it's not a very clear, payback or revenue stream. And so one of the thoughts that I've sort of, and just picking up on individual action, Caroline, that you're mentioning is, if we enjoy these beautiful places, so what I was proposing to the government of Costa Rica, everybody loves to go to Costa Rica for vacation, is charge a $5 wetlands recovery or shorelines recovery to increase the resilience of their beautiful beaches, as well as, making it based on the visitors that come to Costa Rica. So similarly, if we enjoy these parks, maybe you could have a user fee type of program that then those fees go into some fund that's government managed or nonprofit managed, that then does all the investing to make these, wonderful places more resilient. That's just a thought process that I've spent some time thinking about how to increase, and it's called adaptation finance. And it's a difficult thing to do, and it mostly falls on governments or public, state and local. And it's difficult when they have, financial constraints of their own, right? It makes it more difficult.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Let me just ask Chris one more question, and then I want to open the Q&A to any audience questions that we've received. So Keegan has been monitoring that. I also want to be sensitive of time and try to end right around 1 o'clock. So Chris, here's one more question for you. Given some of the climate change projections, including increased flood risk and sea level rise, what are some of those biggest challenges that the Anacostia Watershed Society faces right now, and how can we work together to address those challenges? So we have developers, architects, planners, lawyers, etc., on the line. And I'm curious, how can we begin to partner on some of those challenges, and which of these challenges require the most innovative thinking?
Well, I think we've been talking about some of them. It's clearly management of water, both from a river conservation standpoint and from a straight up water management standpoint, is going to be extremely important. And as I said, so much water management is changing now, but so much water management in this country, not just in DC, but across the country, is based on projections of how much water there's going to be where at any given time. And all of that has kind of been thrown up in the air, whether you're talking about, water supply for irrigators out west, or, potential flood waters. What is a 100-year floodplain? Is it now no longer a 100-year floodplain? Is it a 50-year floodplain? Is it a 5-year floodplain now? All of these rules have changed. So there really needs to be, amongst all of the people you just described, doctors, lawyers, scientists, geologists, map makers, there needs to be, all of them need to be working together to understand and adapt to this new environment, where the sort of planning certainty we had around water resources 50 years ago just doesn't exist anymore. And that requires a certain flexibility and adaptability to long-term planning, which long-term planners aren't often comfortable with. When I used to work out west in the Rio Grande Basin, for example, they would do water use and allocation plans that would go out 50 years. And then they would, it would be a big spasm of planning, and they would do it, and they'd say, oh, well, okay, that's done. We don't have to worry about that for 50 years. And people would go off and do their thing. That's over now. And there needs to be a much more flexible, much more creative, much more adaptive water use management planning than there used to be. And that's going to create uncertainties, but it also creates opportunities. It creates opportunities for regulators to think more creatively about not just regulating, but incentivizing better water management. And Aaron was describing some of those programs in the River Smart programs. AWS has been a proud partner with DOE on River Smart programs for a long time, and they're very effective. JP was talking about the investment opportunities they're created. And sometimes when you have uncertainty, even and regulatory uncertainty, financial uncertainty, that's unsettling, but it also creates opportunities. It creates opportunities for creative new investments to solve these problems. So that's sort of the short answer to your very complex question, is we all just need to think more creatively and more flexibly and more adaptively about water resources management, about urban development, about how we engage stakeholders and communities in these things, because the planning and investment and regulatory environment that we're in has been kind of scrambled by climate change, but potentially at the end of the day in a creative way.
Yeah, I love what you're saying too about having a plan, having a longer term plan. Like, how JP was quoting that DC is trying to get to carbon neutral by 2032. How will we get there? We all need to have the same ambition for that and to align on that. And just like you're saying, we all need to kind of innovatively, but also flexibly align on some of these goals towards resilience before it gets too late. So thank you to each of you for your leadership in that, and for your voice in that is then propelled to action in our communities. Keegan, I'm wondering, do you have some questions from the audience that the panelists might be able to answer?
Yes. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, we have 2 questions so far. The first is from Elando Serrano. How can young professionals and students advocate equitable climate policy at the local level? I'm currently serving as the vice president of the Finance and Economics Club at Bowie State University. I would love further conversation with you all to potentially collaborate with students / recent graduates from my university.
So advocacy for local policy. Who wants to take that question?
I'll take a first stab at it. I believe that youth are really in a position to really influence policy in a pretty important way, particularly local government. I do a lot of work with local governments, with county councils and city councils and district council. And let me tell you, they love to hear from young people. You know, at public testimony days when they have a hearing and the public can come and testify, and legislators will sit and listen to people like me coming in and talking, and I can see where it becomes sort of a drone for these decision makers, quite frankly. And then a young person appears, a college student, a high school student, and gives their perspective on these issues. It's really powerful, and I don't think that youth should underestimate the power that their voices have in decision-making circles, because I think a lot of folks assume, well, anybody who doesn't vote doesn't have any power. But again, I've seen these decision makers really respond to youthful voices, and if youth doesn't vote now, they'll vote later. So their voice is more powerful than they think.
Yeah, that's a great encouragement, I think, for that student at Bowie. Keegan, is there any other question?
Yes, we have one from Joshua Cooper. Aloha, I'm Joshua from Maui, Hawaii. We are also organizing resilience hubs with the mayor of Maui. Would you be able to give more examples of resilience hubs in DC and how we can share best practices and explore more creative elements to better serve the community?
Sure, I can jump in there. So we have one pilot resilience hub that's up and running in Ward 7. It's called the they just changed their name. Am I going to get it right? The Resilience Incubator at FH Fauntleroy, which is a community organization located in Ward 7. It's in or just touching the 100-year floodplain. It's a community-based organization, not a DC agency or our own property. So we've been kind of doing technical assistance to them to help them both make some physical improvements to their building so that it's a little more resilient to the flooding. We've given them a grant to do a resilient energy system with a battery so they can stay online during a power outage. A lot of being a resilience hub is more about programming that they're offering to kind of educate people about risk and become a place that people will turn to and trust if the power goes out or if there's a flooding event. We're taking that now and extrapolating the lessons learned, trying to support other organizations and start to think about how we can build our rec centers or libraries to sort of perform a similar role that people would turn to during an emergency. But I definitely follow up if you want to talk to, there's another person in my office who works on this even more than I do, and we could have a follow-up conversation about what's going on in Maui.
Yeah, Maui went through so much devastation with those fires. That is a very interesting context to kind of compare and contrast with DC and how we can partner there. I see one more question from Matthew Johnston. Any words of wisdom or perspective on how to adapt to the current administration's likely assault on climate and sustainability actions and funding? Anyone feel like they could take that on? Okay, JP, go for it.
I don't have any words of wisdom, but I do have sort of a story to share. When the first Trump administration happened, what ended up sort of stabilizing things in climate was that the European government stepped up, and my former organization worked on something called the EU, European Union, and US States Climate Alliance. And so my point is the US Climate Alliance is called the USCA. It's really a state level driven organization, and it's all about we're still in. That really sort of showed the world that it's not just the federal government, it's state and local action. One of my favorite lines is we need armies of sustainability professionals, and we also need a lot more, partnerships. So I think in these times when you're sort of dealing with, you know, what we thought was one step forward, the IRA law, the bipartisan infrastructure law had a ton for EV. I've done quite a bit in electric vehicle charger stations infrastructure as well, that you seek out partnerships. And I think people are going to have to step up both on the individual level, but also there's a third bucket. There's sort of private money, there's public money, and there's a third bucket called philanthropic or impact capital. This country has a ton of philanthropic capital. It's very difficult to access. So I'm not saying, run off and start applying for grants. But I do see a ton of interest and sort of a real keen, let's do something about this moment. Just I'll throw out something, a number that you guys probably haven't heard about. Donor assisted funds is this way that you can basically donate your money into an account managed by your typical fund manager, call it Fidelity, call it Morgan Stanley. And those are funds that are tax deductible. So on year one, that DAF pool is over $250 billion today for US families that have set up these grants. And so those can also be used to make investments, and accessing that type of funding, requires having a plan, having a program like the Anacostia River watershed, and that to me is another area where, in the absence of federal government action, other actors have to step up. And it's usually state and local, but it's also nonprofit and private that have to step up, as well as retail, right? So we're your retail investors, taking a big risk on angel deals. That, we share the risk. We all have, some skin in the game, but we're like-minded and we're trying to do something about this. Partnering with like-minded organizations and like-minded governments is another way of doing it, and whether those be international or state and local. So not a great moment for us to be in. I fully acknowledge that. I've been in what I call post-election depression, post-inauguration depression, and now post-Liberation Day depression for a while. But you have to keep on keeping on, because this is the challenge of our lifetimes, and we need to, leave it to our kids in better shape, hopefully, than what we found it in.
Thank you so much, JP. By the way, I wanted to just encourage those on the line, if you're interested in joining our committee who partners with organizations like this, to hear from them, but also to volunteer with them, feel free to reach out to myself or Keegan or anyone else at UNA-NCA to get connected. And I see some, Emily asked a question about how can, are there ways to plug in as volunteers with the work that you all are doing? And yeah, I would just love to end with that, to say we would love to volunteer with anything that's possible that you all are working on to take action for climate justice in our community. So please feel free to share those opportunities either in the chat or speak about them right now if you feel comfortable.
Absolutely. As far as the Anacostia Watershed Society is concerned, we have a very active volunteer program where folks can come out and help us with our field conservation work. That includes trash cleanups and servicing trash traps. It includes wetlands plantings, invasive species removal, helping out with our mussel propagation work. All sorts of different types of activities. We're a relatively small organization, and we rely on a lot of volunteer boots on the ground to help us out. And everything I just mentioned and more is contributing to climate resilience, because going back to one of the first things I said in this conversation, one of the keys to climate resilience is a healthy, vibrant ecosystem, which is what we're working for at AWS. So come to our website, anacostiaws.org. Go to our events calendar. You can find all of our volunteer opportunities. We would love to see you out there. Earth Day, we're celebrating Earth Day on April 26th. those folks in the DC area, come out, get on our website, come out to an Earth Day site and help us do an Earth Day cleanup. That'd be a great place to start.
Love that idea. Thank you. Any other thoughts before we close out? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate each of the panelists for sharing your insights and, for kind of opening our minds to some of the possible ways that we can continue pushing forward climate justice here in the DMV at this time. So thanks for everyone that joined. Thank you to the panelists. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, thanks
Great
for
to
having
meet-
us.
Nice to meet you, Aaron and Chris.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great day, everyone.
You too.